Well, our next guest has even experienced this in her own life. Mary DeMuth is a podcaster, an author, and she joins us now to share some fascinating stories about the most misunderstood women of the Bible and how their stories provide hope and encouragement for anyone who feels misunderstood. Mary, welcome to Hope Today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Mary, what got you on this path to study women of the Bible who have felt misunderstood?
Well, I had that experience myself. I think all 100% of humanity has been misunderstood, but I had this kind of deeper misunderstanding with a friend a couple of years ago, and it just lingered with me for so long. And then at the same time, I was reading the Bible over and over and over again rapidly. So every 2 or 3 months, I was reading the whole Bible. And I realized that a lot of these stories of women had been in my head from sermons, but I wasn't really reading their stories in a plain way. And so basically, I took those two ideas of being misunderstood and reading the Bible in a plain way, and it got married into a book. So that's why I wrote the book.
Okay. We have alluded to Hagar twice already in the program. Tell us what you found out when you were studying Hagar and how misunderstood and used she felt.
Right. So she was, as you mentioned, an Egyptian slave, and she also showed kind of what the Exodus would have looked like because she came out of Egypt. So it's kind of beautiful parallel of scripture there. But she actually had no volition to be able to say no when she was given to Abraham. And so in that sense, she was misunderstood because her humanity was misunderstood. She was seen as an object or a means to an end. And that makes her a lot like a lot of us. Sometimes we've had that part of ourselves misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. Well, she didn't want to go sleep with Abraham. She was forced.
No.
She was forced to do something that she did not want to do. She was under somebody's authority. So what do we do in that moment where we feel like we just had to do something that we didn't want to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of us relate to that, especially when we've been in situations of abuse or power hierarchy where we couldn't say no to something. And that's why I love Hagar, because she is the first woman in the Bible to actually have a strong emotion. She is the first human to be visited by an angel. She has all these amazing things happen to her. And of course, the one who names God and gives God a name. And twice this happens. So she flees twice, once before pregnancy, once after, and or kind of around that same time, and then when she has the child. And so she's out there. Her name actually means flight. And she has these incredible encounters with God. God absolutely sees her. And she also names her son God Hears. And so we see this beautiful picture of God, the God of the broken, the God of the oppressed, who is the God who sees and the God who hears us.
You know, one of the things I've always wrestled with, Mary, with that whole story is that God tells her to go back and submit to Sarah's leadership, which I wouldn't have told her that. It's just, you know, how do you wrestle through that part of the story?
I think it's there for so many people around the world, especially those suffering for their faith right now, to know that we live in an unjust system and the kingdoms of this world are not fair. And there will be a day when all those tears are wiped away. But right now we are called to persevere through those trials, knowing that the testing of our faith will produce endurance. And she's a really great example of someone who endured through that kind of trial.
When you were studying about these women of the Bible, which woman kind of shook you? Her story just kind of rattled you deep within inside.
As a sexual abuse survivor, of course, Bathsheba and Tamar, the second Tamar, really resonated with me. But what I loved about the story of Tamar was that her story was unfinished. And I think a lot of people who have walked through that kind of heartache have that unfinished healing story. Like you walk through trauma, but then there's another layer of trauma and it continues to happen and continues to happen. But the beautiful thing about Tamar is that her name means date palm. And if you've been in the Middle East, you'll see that date palms start on the ground and then eventually they shoot up like a palm tree and they produce dates. And her end of her life, when there's hints of restoration because her name was actually the name that her brother, who she lived with for the rest of her life, he gave his daughter her name. And so there's this beautiful kind of redemption that happens in her life, even though she doesn't have a finished story.
Let's talk about the woman who brought not only life into the world, but also death.
Yes, so Eve was an amazing human being, and I think a lot of blame has been leveled her way. We often hear about it's all her fault, and we blame her for menstrual cramps and all sorts of things and giving birth. But we forget a couple things about the story. And again, this is getting back to that idea of having a plain reading of Scripture. When all these things were happening to her, Adam was actually standing right there, but he was silent. And so she basically went through this temptation alone without help. And I think a lot of us miss that in the text. The other thing that I think is really interesting about her is when God is walking in the garden after the fall of humankind, she actually does a normal, good confession. She says, the serpent deceived me and I ate. She actually told the truth. Adam, on the other hand, shifted blame not only to her, but to God, saying, it's the woman that you gave me. And we see a lot of blame leveled at him throughout the Old and New Testament. And so what I'm trying to say is that they are equally at fault. She's not at fault. She's definitely at fault, but he is as well. And it's important that we look at that. Plus, how beautiful is it that she doesn't have a name when she is deceived by the serpent? She's just called woman. She's part of taxonomy. Adam gives her a name after the fall and names her Eve. And then she begins to give life to humankind, which is just such a beautiful picture of redemption, that after this horrible thing and death entered the world, now she gets to give life to a child. The other thing that I think is interesting about her story is that she didn't have a mom, and she never experienced childbirth before. She didn't know how to raise a child. She was looking at the animals most likely, and animals are a lot more independent. So it must have been weird for her to see her child not walk for an entire year, for instance. So she had nothing to go on when she was raising that first generation.
This has made you feel more empathy towards other women. So how can we activate that empathy deep within when you feel so hardened by circumstances that have happened?
I think part of that is, of course, the forgiveness journey, of just learning to be a person of forgiveness. Jesus is, obviously our best example of that, and we're more like Jesus when we're forgiving. But also giving people the benefit of the doubt and not jumping to negative conclusions. There was a study in the University of Washington, the Gottman Institute, that talked about what is the determiner of a marriage that will succeed. And they would even look at pre-married couples. And what they found was those who assumed positive intent were the ones who are most likely to stay married. And that is a trait that we do not foster in our world. We always jump to the negative conclusion. And so it is a spiritual discipline to learn how to think the best of others. And of course, we see that in the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13 as well.
Can we talk about Rahab? I love her story. And I want you to share just a quick of the beginning, what they keep calling her whole life, and then the fruit of her life.
Yeah, so of course we know she is Rahab the harlot, and so her middle name for the rest of her life is and last name is harlot. And that's got to be frustrating. But I think a lot of women and men relate to this, where you become the sum of the sin of the past. And there is something really difficult about having sexual shame as the moniker of your life. But the good news of the gospel is that we are set free. We are not defined by the sins of our past. And of course, we see Rahab, she's so much not that. She is the an instrument of deliverance. And then we see her in the lineage of Christ. And so what a powerful thing. She is a pagan woman who is a harlot or a prostitute, and she is used mightily by God and then ends up in that lineage. So her story tells us that anything is possible with the Lord.